It is my pleasure to be on a panel now and to moderate it with Mark Osler and Todd Haugh. Mark is a law professor at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minnesota, and Todd is with I want to get this right, the Institute for Corporate Government Governance and Ethics at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. That's a mouthful. And they are both integral to our federal expungement initiative, which we're going to wind up talking a little bit about. But I just have you all know that as Mark will talk about, and as Jeffrey Toobin talked about earlier, the power of the pardon is constitutionally left to the president. But there's no reason why Congress could not pass an expungement law like we have in many states. So we're working on that. I'm not going to belabor that too much right now, but I can tell you if you want more information, go to federalexpungement.org. We'd love your support. We're sending out information, and we are in the process of writing a bill and to promote it to senators and Congress people in a bipartisan way that hopefully will get something passed down the road. We're going to start off with a presentation by Mark about pardons primarily. And he gave us a version of this at our White Collar Support Group Tuesday night speaker series. We have a speaker series once a month that's open to the public, unlike our Monday night meetings, which is just closed for people who are directly justice impacted. And Mark did such an incredible job of giving us history and an understanding of what pardons are. And so we've asked him to do an abbreviated version of that today. After that, Todd and I will come back on and speak with Mark, kind of bring things up to date as to where we are with pardons, probably some expungements, and then maybe a little bit of a conversation about, the pros and cons of putting a pardon application in, because it's tricky. And a lot of people have heard about it, read about it. Maybe you're being solicited by people who want to help you get pardons, and maybe that's a good idea, maybe that's not. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and then Mark is going to run his deck, his PowerPoint, and then after that, we'll talk about it a little bit. So please join me in welcoming Mark Osler and Todd Haugh.
All right. And thank you so much, Jeff. It's really it's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of the group as a whole. I'm not going to revisit what Jeff Toobin already covered very well. So I'm going to I agree with everything he said except for one thing when he said I was the foremost authority on the Obama clemencies. I think there's a lot of people who are smarter than me who have talked about clemency lately, and certainly Cynthia Roseberry, for one, who ran that project. Not to mention the people who lived it. And I think that's important to recognize that no one understands the clemency process better than someone like Jason Hernandez, who wrote himself out of prison with his own petition. But let me start my PowerPoint here. Okay. All right. So first of all, a little bit about myself. I am different than a lot of people who work in this space. I'm a former prosecutor. I was a federal prosecutor in Detroit from 1995 to 2000, then started to teach at Baylor, got tenure there, came up to Minneapolis to teach here in 2010, and then went back to prosecution in 2023, 2024. I took a year of leave and became the deputy county attorney here in Hennepin County in charge of the criminal division. I also run a clemency clinic. I'm a doctrinal professor, but I have a clinic that does clemency for people in the federal system, and we've done that since 2010. I want to talk about clemency, and again, I'm gonna talk about things other than what Jeff Toobin did. I want to talk about things before and after what he focused on so well. want to talk about expungement and also on a new focus that we're seeing from this administration on restoring just gun rights to people. And then finally, the role of culture in all of this, which I think is really important. Um, so, a little history of clemency and then a discussion of the chaos in the system, of which there's a lot right now. First of all, with terms, I think it's important to define those. That when we talk about pardons, commutations, remissions of fines, and reprieves, usually we're talking about pardons and commutations. And what a pardon does is, sometimes people think, oh, it negates the conviction, everything is gone. Not quite. It affects many of the aspects of the conviction, certainly. Amnesty, we usually use that term when there's a pardon before a charge is made. And a commutation is when just the sentence is reduced. Now, importantly, commutations can reduce any part of the sentence, including the fine or restitution. We usually tend to think about federal clemency, but it's important to recognize the role of state clemencies. That there's 53 different models in the United States. We're talking about the federal system, where the president has that sole authority, as Jeff Toobin described. But in other places, there's very different systems in place. Here in Minnesota, the governor makes the decisions in conjunction with the Board of Pardons. We reformed our system here in 2023, and the number of grants is set to go up. Well, the trajectory right now, 400% since those reforms were put in. So process does matter. In Rhode Island, the governor does it with the advice and consent of the state Senate. And in South Carolina, there's an independent board. So in the states, there's a lot of different processes and a lot of different outcomes from those. We've got some systems that are much more productive than others. Jeff Toobin talked about the clemency being a legacy of the kings and queens of England, and that's true, but it goes back way further than that, back to the earliest codes of law, to the Code of Hammurabi. In one form or another, we find it in many cultures. The thinking often, when it's articulated in a societal sense, is that mercy lends credence to the system. And I'll circle back to that later. One of the things that happened, I started examining clemency after working for a long time on the crack powder disparity and won a case in the Supreme Court, but it wasn't retroactive. And so Doug Berman called me the day that the decision came down and said, yeah, now we have to work on clemency. And I don't know very much about clemency. So I did what anybody does. I Googled it and I misspelled clemency. And what came up was a Roman coin. But this Roman coin bore the name of the Roman goddess of clemency, Clementia. In other words, the Romans believed so much, not just in the idea of mercy, but in mercy by the government, that they created a goddess to represent that. And I think that's really powerful. Jeff Toobin talked about this, that we've seen a reduction in the rate of grants in modern presidents. It's gone down. George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush both had pretty low numbers. But I want to talk about what's going on now, and with particularly an eye to those of you that are thinking, okay, what should I do? Should I apply for a pardon? Is there something else that's about to come down the road that might be a better bet? And so I think it's important to understand the current context right now. If you were to send a pardon petition in tomorrow, what's the context you're sending it into? So I'm going to focus on the recent history. Basically Trump, Biden, and Trump. I don't seem to be able to change my. There we go. So in 2016, I went to the White House and gave a talk in the Obama era. And, they had a panel of experts, and Valerie Jarrett was running the thing. There to my right is Mike Romano from Stanford, and Cynthia Roseberry is next to him. 2 years later, in 2018, I was invited to the Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump had a meeting on the same subject. You can see the picture there, and I'm sitting across from, yes, Kim Kardashian. So that was a very different type of experience. But I will say that um, both of those administrations invited serious conversations about clemency, something that we didn't see with Biden, unfortunately, that there never was a discussion about what could be and should be. It was closed off, and as it was in a lot of other things. Now, when we look at the most recent past, there's really four big trends. And one is that with both Biden and Trump, we saw big categorical grants. And this is something that we haven't really seen of late. Of course, Jimmy Carter's amnesty for people from the Vietnam era was a big categorical grant. But even Obama's program was very individualized. There was that incredible process that people had to go through. They were vetted very carefully as opposed to just considered to be in a category. Even though they had criteria, they very often didn't end up following those criteria. And the overwhelming majority of both the Biden and the Trump grants were outside of the established process. That is, where someone files a petition to the pardon attorney, it advances its way through the Department of Justice, over to the White House counsel's office, and then to the president. I'm not going to go into it here, but Rachel Barco and I have been very critical of that process as being too bureaucratic and not efficient or productive. But that was the process that people had access to. And both Biden and Trump sidestepped that and the experts that were involved in that process. Also, with both Biden and Trump, we've seen grants to people who are convicted of violent crimes, something that often was seen as a bright line that presidents weren't willing to cross. And finally, the big trend is that it's been very turbulent, that these are rough waters right now. And it's in part because there have been a series of grants that have, I think, shaken a lot of people's trust in what clemency means. So the winter of 24 and 25, we saw really some extraordinary things happen. Jeff Toobin talked about the Hunter Biden pardon, but Biden also took about 1,500 people who were out already on the CARES Act and commuted their sentences. Something certainly many of us were in favor of, but it was a broad categorical grant. He commuted 37 death sentences to life in prison. And on the 17th of January, he commuted the sentences of 2,490 people. And I'll go back to talk about that because that one, it kind of slipped under the radar, but it was really significant because it appeared to be a categorical grant and they didn't go through the process. On the 19th, he did those 8 preemptive pardons to Anthony Fauci, family members that Jeff Toobin alluded to earlier. And also on the 19th, there were 6,000 denials in one day, just a huge dump of cases. And then Trump came in, and the next day gave clemency to about 1,500 participants in the events of January 6th. Now, that's not even including Leonard Peltier and Ross Ulbricht, who received clemency during that period as well. So the 2,490 clemencies that occurred, those were not vetted by the pardon attorney. And the pardon attorney at the time, Elizabeth Hoyer, was upset. She sent an email that became public that those commutations involved people with violent backgrounds who otherwise wouldn't meet the department standards for recommendations for receipt of clemency. And I got a lot of calls from people in prison that I know as these were coming down, and they were baffled because many of them had pending petitions. There would be somebody they knew who had never filed a petition who was suddenly walking out. One of whom reported that the person who was being released from his prison was actually in solitary for having smuggled narcotics into the prison at the time he was released. That denial of 6,000 cases in one fell swoop was also significant. Um, we're not sure, how they were identified and what was going on there. But the theory is that it was all the remaining case that didn't have a positive recommendation. Now, of course, that left hundreds and hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 cases that did have a positive recommendation that weren't acted on and still haven't been. And then with Trump, we had the January 6th defendants and the controversy that came with that, and those grants of pardons and some commutations. So the question is, what comes next, and what do we make of this? Well, first of all, categorical grants are back, and that's something that may mean. I know that Jeff Toobin said apply if you know somebody or if you have a connection. There's certainly something to that, but also if there's ways to define categorical grants and to have that connection, it could be a way to amplify the effect. The second is to recognize that the process is in flux. So what does this mean if you're considering filing a pardon petition? Well, first of all, pitching those categories can be worthwhile. That you do have to remember that you have to appeal to presidential imperatives. And the things that President Trump seems to respond to are over prosecution under President Biden in particular, some under Obama as well. People whose crimes related to the law enforcement or the military. And one that hasn't really been used, but I think would be a appealing category to some of the administration is to posit it as being a part of overregulation, where people's regulatory offenses led to a criminal conviction, of which there's been a lot. And there's been criticism of that for a while, including by Paul Larkin at the Heritage Foundation and others who may have influence on the administration. So if you do file a pardon application, what's happening with it right now? The pardon attorney's office still exists. It's still there. Ed Martin is the pardon attorney, although he has two other jobs, and I would imagine spends most of his time at those other jobs. The attorney staff within the pardon attorney's office has been greatly reduced. Most of those people appear to have taken the buyouts that were offered. And so there just isn't the staff in the pardon attorney's office that there used to be. So it's unclear what's happening with cases. Many of us have observed that when you file a case now, it takes longer to even get a confirmation that it's been filed. So things do seem to have slowed down. Alice Marie Johnson, who has been named as the pardon czar, she does appear to have some influence. But what there isn't, unfortunately, is there isn't a process with open access to her the way there is. So we have a process with open access, which is the petition form that goes to the pardon attorney's office. And then we've got this person of influence with no way that the average person can access that process. And in the end, what I hope for is that the process can become open to all and centered in the White House. And we'll see. That's something that the next administration, whether Republican or Democrat, will have to deal with. Also, it appears that though Trump was pretty active upon taking office, that it's kind of on pause at the moment. That there's been no grants since May 29th. So if you're thinking about applying, keep in mind it could be a long game. That pardon petitions right now, when they are granted, it seems to be either early or late. In other words, some people have gotten pardons without applying at all. And some as soon as, the pardon application is solicited and then granted. Others are waiting many, many years. I have clients with exceptional cases where they've been pending for 4 and 5 years. That doesn't mean it might not still be worth doing. One thing to keep in mind is that if you file a pardon petition now, it may not be seriously considered until the next administration. But that means too that you can, because they're not rejected automatically when a new administration comes in. So that means you may get the consideration of 2 administrations, but it also means that there's going to be a long wait. I do want to talk about expungement. We had Jeff was talking about the new initiative. what that involves is removing the records of conviction. It's not the same as a pardon. Most states have it, but there is no expungement process in the federal system, which is really a huge hole. It's usually done by the courts in most of the states, and many states have limits on the cases that are eligible, though usually uh, one of those limits is the dividing line between violent and nonviolent cases. This group has sponsored this expungement initiative. We've already begun having discussions with stakeholders. There's a link there to where you can find more information about it. And Rachel Barco and Doug Berman, who really are foremost experts, are involved in that, and I'm learning a lot from them as we go along. Now, expungement versus clemency both erase some effects of the conviction. Differences are that expungement may not restore right, and who the decider is in most places is different. It's the courts versus the president, and that means that often, someone is going back to sometimes the same judge, sometimes the same courthouse is where the conviction happened. With expungement, we do generally see that the process is more regular and consistent, though. Now, there's something new that this administration seems pretty focused on, which is 18 USC 925C allows the Attorney General to restore gun rights. And in July, they proposed a rule to create a process by which people can apply directly for that. And it would be primarily for those convicted of nonviolent crimes. It won't restore other rights, it won't expunge the record, but it would allow people to possess firearms. And so if that's something you're interested in, go to the pardon attorney's website, and they are doing a pretty good job of keeping track of where that rule approval process is. And eventually they will put up a form by which you can apply for that single right to be restored under the statute. Now, finally, I do want to talk about the role of culture. Culture eats policy for lunch, and culture creates policy. That if we want any of these changes to move forward, I think there needs to be a cultural change towards defining restoration and mercy as an essential part of the justice process. In other words, going back to that ancient ideal that the goddess Clementia represented. And not that clemency is a replacement for punishment, as its opponents sometimes present it, but rather it's a complement to it, something that gives punishment more authority, because we are a nation that believes in second chances. That doesn't mean we don't believe in punishment. Those two things go together. In my own faith tradition, which I realize isn't everyone's, people often quote to me Micah 6:8. In fact, it was over the door of Baylor Law School when I was teaching there, which says, He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And often people focus on the justice part or the mercy part, but I think the key really is the humility part. That as a society, we have to have the humility to see the truth that people change, to step back from the harsh judgment, the arrogance that goes with that, and allow that other side to prevail. Something that we saw in Western civilization, that we saw in the best of our own country, in the history of the United States. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Mark, thank you for just a brilliant presentation again for our group. Thank you so much. So we're going to go to a little bit of discussion. Let me just tell you how the federal expungement initiative got off the ground. I was watching a webinar that was moderated by Doug Berman at Ohio State Law School, and Rachel Barco was one of the panelists. And it was about pardons, but out of her mouth came this one sentence. There's nothing preventing Congress from enacting a federal expungement law. So I called her up and I said, is this true? And she said, yes. And I said, I think our white collar support group might want to get behind this and, and put some energy behind it. And she said, okay, I'm in, but you're going to have to get some other experts involved. And so we have two of those experts here. We have Todd, Haugh, and Mark. So one of the things about both of them that I think is really fascinating is that they're not just scholars and they're not just teachers, but they have on the ground projects, actual initiatives and clinics that they're actually doing work out in the community and interacting and advancing students' experiences in doing these things. So Todd, if we could let's start with you, and why don't you tell us, if you would, like what is goes on at the institute and what clinically what are you doing there, and how is that supposed to advance the criminal justice cause?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And Mark, it's great to hear your comments, particularly this idea of, thinking about mercy for all people that are affected by the criminal justice system. I think, I spent so much of my career focused on white collar offenders, and there's this weird disconnect where sometimes we have mercy for people. We tend to think about that people who are similar to us, right? We would associate, we'd be more merciful people who are similar to us. But when white collar offenses, it almost flips, right? So we sort of look at those folks and somehow we can have this lack of empathy. And so that's been something I've been really interested in, both as a scholar and in practice. So one thing that my institute does, we're the Institute of Corporate Governance and Ethics, I try to think about how we can help organizations sort of run better in a more ethical way. I'm in a business school, so it sort of makes sense that that would be our focus. But my personal work has always been focused on white collar offenders. So one of the projects that we have undertaken, the group of research assistants, is looking at pardons and commutations, not wholesale, but just of for white collar pardons. And so maybe Jeff, I'll just give a couple seconds on some stats that might be interested that this group might be interested in. So if you go back and we've looked at kind of about the last 40 years, 40 to 50 years of presidents, although we're going back farther now. If you look at the numbers, consistently about more than 50% of pardon grants have been for white collar offenders. And so, the highest percentages of the total amount of pardons given, that comes in the first Trump administration. Is about 70% of his grants were for white collar offenders. But if you look consistently back to George H.W. Bush, it has been around 50 or higher over the last number of years. Now, the numbers get a little skewed when you talk about the second Trump presidency because we have the pardons of the Jan 6 offenders. And so that obviously skews the numbers because that's a lot of folks. But if you take those out, we're still, even at the beginning of his presidency, upwards of 40%. So, that's kind of one picture that I don't think a lot of people have focused on, which is just white collar offenders specifically. That they make up a very large percentage of our overall pardon grants. It's different when we're talking about commutations. So in the commutation sense, now we're at about a third of commutation grants. Again, the numbers get a little skewed when you talk about these categorical grants because now we're talking about thousands of people at a time. And then if you take those out, the numbers will sort of normalize a little bit. So that is one project that we have undertaken that we're going to continue to work on over this semester. But a lot of what our center does is to try to look at, how do we help organizations help their employees be more ethical? How do we use behavioral science oftentimes to think about those tools, about those issues? And, with the idea of an organization being kind of like the front lines of ethical decision making and practices for many white collar offenders, that's where our focus has been.
Uh, Thank you, Todd. And I'm going to let a little bit of cat out of the bag. Todd and I and the White Collar Support Group have been talking about how to create an advocacy clinic so that we as white collar offenders or people who are engaged in the process can advocate for ourselves and get access to resources And we agreed to talk about it more thoroughly right after the conference. So I don't think that's going to be at 12:01, but it should be in the next few days. So thank you for that, Todd. Um, Mark, you have a clinic, you have a clemency clinic that's actually run and up and running. So why don't you just tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I started that in 2011. It's really one of the reasons I came to St. Thomas. I had tenure and everything at Baylor and came up and gave a faculty talk at St. Thomas. And on the way back, the dean said, uh, do you ever think about leaving Baylor? And I said, I don't know. And he said, well, what would you want? And I told him I'd want to have a clinic. And he said, we can do that. And so I work with my students. We sit around a table and go through my mail and sort through the cases, collaboratively pick the cases that we're going to take. I have 9 students this year. We're taking 9 cases, so we're already booked this year. Um, and I send my students out to prison. I raised some money, although we're out. So if you're thinking about a donation, it would be appreciated. But what we do is um, we send the students out to spend 2 days at prison. And they travel all over the country because we do federal cases. They go in pairs of two. And the reason that they go for 2 days is because it's important to build trust that first day. And then that second day is often when you have the more honest discussion. Um, to be honest, too, I think that unfortunately, and I think some of you have lived this, our clients are people who have had a lot of people tell them they're going to come back who don't come back. And when we come back that second day, we're being different than those people. And I think that builds a lot of trust. So not only are we able to help people with their clemency petition, and often, it works out, but it's transformative for the students. Many of them are going to go on to be prosecutors. But imagine how different a prosecutor is going to be having had that experience of having spent 2 days of genuinely caring about the outcome the way people do when they make that personal connection. So in terms of, changing the world, the best we as teachers can do is that. And that's what we try to do with the clinic, Jeff.
Thank you, Mark. So Todd, Mark, just in the last few minutes we have here, it feels like since the early Trump pardons, there's like a mad rush for people to get their pardon applications in, and for people to be out there kind of as a cottage industry, saying that they can help people get pardons. And one of my concerns is that people are doing it too fast, without a lot of thought, without understanding what the consequences can be. Um, Certainly, once you put your story out there, even in a pardon application, it's public domain, and there might be consequences down the road that you haven't considered in terms of what your life arc is going to be, and was it really a good idea giving the government access to all of that information? So, what do you each think about what would be really reasonable now, and what are reasonable expectations, and what should people be considering as they're thinking about maybe I should put a pardon application in, and who should I trust with that? Todd, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll clearly be interested to hear what Mark says. I mean, I guess my worry greatly is that, if what Jeff Toobin is saying is correct, that this is really in the moment a very transactional process, and it is about who you know. That opens up opportunity for people, but it opens up a lot of opportunity also for grift and corruption and a certain type of fraud, frankly, from those who are holding themselves out as having connections with people in the administration. So I can appreciate. I was a white collar criminal defense attorney for a decade before I started practicing. I understand the how difficult it can be for someone who's been through the process, and particularly because if they feel they've been wronged and they've been sentenced, to hold off and sort of slow down. The thing about a pardon is it will help restore some rights, not all, and not all your day-to-day living type rights. But it's not exactly going anywhere, right? So you have time to handle that process in a thoughtful way, find the right people that are honest and trustworthy and actually would have some, legitimate connections and can put together an application for you that's going to be the most successful as it possibly could be. What I would hate to see is someone who is sort of victimized, frankly, twice. To hold off as much as difficult as it would be to not jump at sort of the person who promises you, the too good to be true. And so that's just like, as someone who both has represented people in this situation, but is also someone who writes and thinks a lot about ethical decision making and business ethics. As we know, there are lots of actors out there that are happy to take advantage of this moment, and so I would just sort of counsel everyone, as hard as it is, to slow down, talk to people. Whether it's someone, maybe it's not Mark's clinic, but there are folks that do this and have been very successful at doing this in the past, and take your time to find those folks. That would be my sort of opening statement on this moment, because what we know is this is a new type of moment, right? Like I said this in a group before. For a very, very long time, nobody really considered white collar offenders as like a pardon was a real viable option for you. That was just not really on the table for most of what we know of, the past 20 or 30 years. It just wasn't something that most offenders would even really consider. Now, because it's very public, that has changed, but that also opens up that opportunity for potential problems.
Thank you, Todd. Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I went into this work, one of the things I decided right away was that I would never take money for doing a clemency petition. And that has brought me great joy and freedom, I think. Now, when I say that, I don't begrudge attorneys charging for preparing a clemency petition, even charging a lot because they have access. That's the way everything else works. If you want a lawyer and you've got a patent application, you're going to pay someone to help you with that. And so, even though I don't take money, I don't begrudge people who do. Um, but one thing that you need to keep in mind is it's a long shot for anyone. It's a long shot for anyone. And I think that you have to keep that in mind. If anybody is promising you, we can get this, we've got this great track record, and they're not saying it's a long shot for everyone, I probably wouldn't trust that person very much. Uh, you know, that that said, a long shot is better than no shot. And I think Todd's exactly right about timing. There is no rush. You shouldn't feel a rush unless you happen to be at Mar-a-Lago and you're talking to Donald Trump and he says, give me your deeds, which has happened. Um, yeah, then get it right in. But most of us don't have that imperative or that opportunity. And so take your time with it. Evaluate the people who can help you. Realize that you might be able to do it yourself really well. There have been many people who have prepared petitions that I've reviewed where I tell them, you did a great job. Submit what you did. This is authentic and real and thorough. Um, and I don't have a lot to add. And also think through, are there other options that may be better for me? For example, if what you really care about is restoration of gun rights, your best bet may be waiting until that form becomes available under 925C and pursuing that. And finally, regarding my clinic, I just do want to make clear we're full for this year. So we won't be considering new cases until fall of 26. We've got a new crew of students coming in. That said, I often do talk to people about their own choices that they're making and what they're evaluating.
So thank you. Before we wrap up quickly, Todd, Mark, can you just tell everyone how to contact you if they will, and then we're going to move on to the next portion. All right, Mark.
Yeah, sure. My email address is mark.osler at St. Thomas, which is STTHOMAS, that double T fools people, .edu. So mark.osler at stthomas.edu.
Thank you, Mark. Todd?
Yep, and I'm at Haugh, Thaughh at iu.edu. Otherwise, you can just Google my name and Kelly School, and that will pull up my faculty page and has all my contact information on that.
Thank you both so much. What wonderful, wonderful people present and presenters, and thank you for being with us tonight.